Picture this. It's the longest night of the year, somewhere around 10,000 BC. They had observation accumulated across generations of careful watching. That suspicion had to be enough to keep going. The winter solstice, which falls around December 21st in the northern hemisphere and has done so reliably for longer than our species has been cognitively equipped to notice it, is the single longest stretch of darkness the year produces. Ancient humans treated it as a survival event with cosmic implications. So let's actually think through what that night felt like from the ground level. On the Eurasian Steppe during the height of the last ice age, you're looking at temperatures routinely dropping to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposed skin begins dying within minutes at those temperatures. Breathing through your nose produces actual pain because the moisture inside your nasal passages is essentially freezing on contact with the incoming air. The wind across an open steppe doesn't politely cool you down. A modern human dropped into that environment without preparation would be in serious trouble within a couple of hours. And yet, groups of ancient humans not only survived nights like that, they built functional, multi-generational knowledge systems around doing it reliably and repeatedly. Season after brutal season, without access to anything most modern people would recognize as technology. The structures they built to get through the worst of it were. At sites like Mammoth in Ukraine, researchers found the remnants of dwellings constructed almost entirely from mammoth bones, skulls stacked as foundation blocks, tusks curved overhead into dome frameworks, the whole thing wrapped in layered hides stitched tight enough to hold heat against the worst wind the steppe could produce. Experimental reconstructions of these structures have confirmed that a properly assembled mammoth bone house could maintain interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the outside air using only a modest internal fire. At some point, groups of careful observers across different parts of the world began to realize, by watching the sun's behavior over years and then decades and then generations, that there was a specific moment when the retreat stopped. That the darkness had a boundary. That realization, the shift from hoping the sun would return to actually knowing it would, was one of the most transformative cognitive developments in human history. It's genuinely hard to overstate how much it mattered. Once that knowledge existed, ancient people did exactly what humans always do with information that feels important enough to be dangerous if lost. They built things around it. Newgrange in Ireland is a passage tomb constructed around 3200 BC. That makes it older than the Egyptian pyramids by a comfortable margin. Its interior chamber is aligned with such extraordinary precision that during the winter solstice sunrise, a narrow beam of light travels the entire length of the 19-meter passageway and illuminates the back wall of the chamber for approximately 17 minutes before disappearing again for another full year. 17 minutes of light in a stone chamber that took an estimated 300 to 1,000,000 person-hours to build, depending on which archaeological estimate you find most convincing. That is not a coincidence stumbled into by accident. That is a civilization organizing its entire construction effort around a single astronomical moment it had decided was worth that level of investment. Maeshowe in Scotland pulls off essentially the same trick, aligning its main chamber with the winter solstice sunset rather than the sunrise. That means different builders on a different island independently arrived at the same conclusion about which cosmic event deserved a monument. The precision required to achieve this alignment with Neolithic tools, meaning no surveying equipment, no laser levels, no written trigonometry, is the kind of thing that makes modern architects uncomfortable if they think about it too long. These weren't primitive guesses rounded up to something that looked close enough. The alignments are exact, which means the astronomical knowledge behind them was exact. Accumulated across generations of dedicated observation by people who had decided that tracking the sun's behavior was worth organizing their entire society around. But here's what makes the solstice even more interesting as a survival event specifically, as opposed to just an astronomical one. The knowledge that the solstice marked the turning point meant ancient groups could plan backwards from it in ways that fundamentally changed their odds of surviving the winter. If you know with genuine confidence that the darkest night has a specific position in the year, you can count forward and backward from it with reasonable accuracy. You can time your food stores. You can schedule your most intensive hunting efforts for the weeks before, when you know the worst is coming, rather than scrambling reactively after conditions have already deteriorated past the point where hunting is viable. Prediction, as opposed to hope, is a survival technology, and the pan made of highest existence of usual sciences and wandering. And the confidence engagement techniques founded by a confident and siphonate anti-confidence and wandering is a simple person for when you know the worst is coming, rather than scrambling reactively after conditions have already deteriorated past the point where hunting is viable. Prediction, as opposed to hope, is a survival technology, and the fan made of highest existence is in wandering. Groups that developed it earliest had a meaningful advantage over the ones still operating on fear and instinct alone. Food storage was an engineering challenge on its own terms, completely separate from the shelter question. Ancient humans solved it with the same kind of layered, materials-based thinking they applied to everything else. In permafrost regions across northern Europe and Asia, ancient groups dug underground storage chambers connected to their winter shelters by short tunnels, exploiting the fact that a few feet of frozen ground maintains a stable temperature cold enough to keep meat preserved for months without any additional intervention. These weren't casual pits dug hopefully into the ground. Archaeological evidence shows deliberately engineered chambers at consistent depths, timed construction in specific seasons, ongoing maintenance throughout the winter to keep access tunnels functional. It was a refrigeration system built entirely from geography and physics, with no moving parts and no power source beyond the frozen Earth itself. It worked reliably enough that multiple independent groups across different continents arrived at the same solution. The fat question matters more than almost any other single topic in ancient winter survival. It gets far less attention than it deserves, probably because modern diet culture has made fat such a complicated subject that discussing it without 10 qualifications feels reckless. Ancient humans had no such baggage and were considerably better off for it. Lean protein alone, consumed without adequate fat alongside it, produces a condition sometimes called rabbit starvation, where the body continues breaking down despite receiving what feels like sufficient food. This was because the absence of fat and carbohydrates leaves the metabolism without the fuel it actually needs to function under cold weather stress. Ancient hunters appear to have understood this empirically, even without the biochemistry to explain it, consistently prioritizing marrow, organ meat, fatty tissue over lean muscle when given the option. At the Neumark Nord 2 site in Germany, Neanderthals were systematically crushing large mammal bones from at least 172 individual animals to render bone grease through heating, essentially running a prehistoric fat extraction operation at an industrial scale that no reasonable person looking at the evidence could describe as anything other than deliberate and sophisticated. The fire question is where things get genuinely wild. Maintaining fire across a winter solstice night in extreme cold without reliable ignition technology is a problem that doesn't have a comfortable modern equivalent. Evidence suggests ancient groups physically transported live embers over distances during travel, carrying smoldering material in protective containers rather than trusting their ability to restart a fire from scratch in wet or windy conditions. Imagine being personally responsible for a single ember crossing 3 days of frozen steppe, knowing that the ember is the difference between your group surviving the coming week and your group not surviving it. That's not a metaphor for pressure. That's a documented human experience that happened repeatedly across thousands of years of actual history. The people managing it didn't get to clock out at the end of the shift. The sleep patterns of ancient humans during the longest nights are also a subject that deserves considerably more attention than they typically receive in conversations about how our ancestors actually functioned. Researcher Thomas Ware conducted a 1992 experiment isolating modern participants from artificial light for a month, and found that every single one of them spontaneously shifted to a 2-phase sleep pattern, roughly 4 hours of sleep, then 1 to 2 hours of calm wakefulness, then 4 more hours until morning. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, studying the Juhoensi Bushmen, found that the nighttime waking period served a specific social function. During daylight, roughly 80% of conversation was logistical, hunting plans, resource allocation, practical coordination, but around the fire after dark, 81% of conversation was storytelling. The fire wasn't just a heat source. It was the venue where knowledge got packaged into narrative form durable enough to survive transmission across generations of people who had no writing system to fall back on. The Venus figurines found at Paleolithic sites across Europe, small carved figures with exaggerated physical features, were predominantly discovered in winter shelter contexts, not summer campsites. The cave paintings associated with the Upper Paleolithic, many of which represent some of the most technically accomplished art produced by any human hand in any era, appear to have been created predominantly during the long confinement of winter months, by firelight, in spaces that were also being used as living quarters, storage, social gathering points simultaneously. The longest nights, it turns out, were also the most productive ones in terms of the cultural output that eventually defined the species. There is something almost aggressively ironic about the fact that the conditions most likely to kill an ancient human were also the conditions most reliably associated with the production of things beautiful enough that we're still talking about them tens of thousands of years later. Here's the detail that stops most people when they actually sit with it long enough to process what it means. Building a mammoth bone shelter large enough to house a family group through a full winter required 2 to 3 weeks of intensive construction work by 8 to 10 adults. That means the work needed to commence during the waning months of summer and the onset of autumn, before climatic conditions rendered exterior labor impossible. Archaeological analysis of toolware patterns and seasonal bone deposits at these sites confirms this timing. Ancient people were not reactive builders who scrambled to throw something together once the first serious snow arrived. They were planners operating on multi-month time horizons. with mental calendars sophisticated enough to coordinate labor-intensive construction projects around predicted seasonal shifts months in advance. That is not what popular imagination typically pictures when it pictures Ice Age humans. But that is what the physical evidence actually shows. Solstice celebrations as social events, shared fire, shared food, shared story, appear across so many independent ancient cultures in so many different geographic locations that the convergence feels almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The Romans had Saturnalia, the Norse had Yule, ancient Iranians had Shabe Yalda, the Inca had Inti Raymi. Cultures separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years of independent development all landed on roughly the same answer to the question of what you do on the longest night. You gather. You burn something bigger than usual. You remind each other, loudly and repeatedly, that the light is coming back. Whether the ritual was purely practical, a morale mechanism designed to prevent the psychological collapse that genuine darkness can produce in isolated groups, or whether it had accumulated genuine spiritual significance over generations of repetition, is a question that probably doesn't have a clean answer. It was almost certainly both, deeply tangled together in ways that would have been impossible for the participants themselves to separate. At Newgrange, during the few days around the solstice, there are more applicants each year for the lottery that grants access to the inner chamber at sunrise than there are spots available, by enormous margins. People fly in from multiple countries to stand inside a 5,000-year-old stone corridor and watch 17 minutes of solstice light travel across a floor that has been waiting for it every single year since before written language existed anywhere on Earth. Whatever those Neolithic builders were trying to communicate by aligning that passage with that specific moment, the message has been received and continues to be received by people who have thermostats and electric lights and zero practical need for any of it.